He walked through mud that wasn't entirely mud. The consistency was wrong, too thick in places, too slick in others. Captain Alexander Fleming, Royal Army Medical Corps, 33 years old, had been stationed at this wound research laboratory in Boulogne for 8 months now, and he still couldn't quite adjust to the smell. It wasn't the blood. Blood he could handle. It was what came after. The sweet, rotten sweetness of tissue dying while the patient still lived. The boots of incoming stretcher-bearers announced themselves before Fleming could see the men. That distinctive squelch-and-suck rhythm of feet pulling free from French mud. He didn't look up from his microscope immediately. He was studying a tissue sample from yesterday's amputation, watching how the carbolic acid had created zones of necrosis radiating outward from where it had been applied. The tissue looked like a map of destruction, circular dead zones where nothing lived, not bacteria, not white blood cells, not anything. "Dr. Fleming, sir." The orderly's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had learned not to invest emotion in what he saw daily. Fresh ones, 3 of them. Fleming straightened, his back protesting. The laboratory had been a wine warehouse before the war, and something about its dimensions made standing at the workbenches an exercise in sustained discomfort. "How fresh?" 6 hours, maybe. Shelling at dawn, they kept them stable at the forward station. 6 hours. In this war, that counted as fortunate. Fleming washed his hands in the basin, the water already pink from the previous washing, and followed the orderly to the receiving area. Another boy on the table? 18, maybe 19. Shrapnel wound to the thigh, 3 days old. The leg had swollen to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny, mottled with colors that had no business appearing on human flesh. Purple, green, black at the edges. Fleming had seen this same wound 1,000 times. He would see it 10,000 more before this war ended. The soldier was conscious, which was worse. His eyes followed Fleming with the desperate awareness of a man who understood exactly what was about to happen to him. Fleming had learned to recognize that look. It was different from the look of a man in pain, different from the look of a man who was dying. This was the look of a man watching his future narrowed to a single terrible certainty. "What's your name, soldier?" Fleming asked, pulling on gloves. "Perkins, sir. Thomas Perkins. They said—" The boy's voice cracked. "They said you could save it." The lie was transparent, kind in its way. Someone at the forward station had offered false hope, because false hope was better than the truth when a man still had 6 hours of consciousness ahead of him. Fleming examined the wound without responding. The infection had advanced beyond the initial trauma site. He could see the red lines of lymphangitis creeping up toward the groin. Blood poisoning. The body's highways carrying death to the central station. The protocol was clear. Carbolic acid, the best antiseptic available. Pour it deep into the wound, let it kill everything it touched. Fleming prepared the solution with the careful precision that had characterized every action of his adult life. Measured the concentration, drew it into the irrigation syringe, positioned the tip at the wound's deepest point. The soldier screamed when the chemical hit tissue. They always screamed. Fleming had learned not to flinch at that sound, but he had never learned to ignore what came next. The wound would actually steam slightly when the carbolic made contact with infected tissue, a small chemical exothermic reaction visible if you were watching closely. Fleming was always watching closely. He saw the tissue blanch and then darken. He saw the soldier's body go rigid and then slack as the initial shock of pain gave way to a deeper, grinding agony. "Hold him," Fleming said to the orderlies. though the soldier had already stopped thrashing. Pain in sufficient quantities creates its own paralysis. He continued the irrigation, working methodically, ensuring the antiseptic reached every pocket of the wound. The medical literature was clear on this point. Insufficient application led to treatment failure. Sufficient application led to... Fleming stopped himself from completing the thought. Led to treatment success, according to the literature. The literature was wrong. The leg would be amputated by morning. Not because the shrapnel had destroyed it, because the antiseptic had. The carbolic acid killed bacteria, yes, but it killed white blood cells faster. It killed tissue. It created dead zones where infection could flourish untouched. Fleming had published a paper on this in 1917. He had shown, with careful measurement and photographic evidence, that the standard treatment was making things worse. His superior officer had filed it appropriately. Nothing had changed. He stayed with Perkins through the evening. This wasn't protocol, wasn't necessary, but Fleming found himself unable to leave. The soldier drifted in and out of fevered consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to ask questions Fleming couldn't answer. Will I walk again? Will I go home? Will it hurt when they cut it off? The anesthetic works well, Fleming said, which was the only honest answer he could offer. Perkins died anyway at 3 a.m, before the surgeon ever touched him. The infection moved faster than the surgeon saw. Fleming was there when the boy's breathing changed, when the fever spiked beyond what the body could sustain, when the pulse grew thready and then stopped. He was there when they pulled the sheet over another face that would stay forever young. Fleming walked back to his quarters that night, thinking about something his mentor, Almroth Wright, had said years ago in London. Wright had been talking about vaccines, about training the body's own defenses rather than attacking disease from outside. But Wright's methods worked for prevention, not treatment. They were useless here, in this warehouse converted to a hospital, where boys arrived already infected and died in the night, while doctors stood by with chemicals that destroyed more than they saved. The night air was cold, sharp, with the promise of winter. Fleming could hear distant artillery, a constant low thunder that had become the ambient sound of this war. Somewhere out there, more wounds were being created, more infections were starting their invisible work, more boys were beginning the journey that would end on tables like the one Thomas Perkins had occupied. There had to be something else, something that could kill bacteria without killing everything around it. Something that could reach deep into damaged tissue and stop infection before gangrene set in. Fleming didn't know what that something was. He didn't know if it existed, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had watched too many preventable deaths, that the current answer was no answer at all. This is where it started, not in a laboratory in London 10 years later. Not with a contaminated petri dish and a fortunate accident. It started here, in the mud and blood of France, with frustration and helplessness and the absolute conviction that there must be a better way. It started with Thomas Perkins, whose name Fleming would forget, but whose death would remain, one among thousands, a constant weight that shaped every decision that followed. Before we go deeper into what Fleming found and why the world almost lost it, I want to ask something. If this story has pulled you in already, if you're feeling that first hook of curiosity, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely matters to me. I'm also curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you listening to this late at night? During a commute? While working? I want to know who's on this journey with me. Now, let's talk about what happened when Fleming came home from the war. London in 1918 looked different than the London he'd left. Not in its buildings or streets, those were the same. Different in the spaces between people. Everyone had lost someone. The men who had returned carried France in their eyes, a certain distance that never quite went away. The women who had waited carried their own war, fought in hospitals and munitions factories, and in the terrible silence of homes where certain names could no longer be spoken. Fleming's laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital felt smaller than he remembered, quieter, though the same technicians moved through the same routines they'd performed before the war. The building smelled different from Boulogne, antiseptic in a cleaner way, missing the underlying notes of mud and gangrene. But the essential work was similar. Growing bacteria. Studying bacteria. Finding ways to fight bacteria. He settled back into his position in the inoculation department, working under Wright, studying bacteria, preparing vaccines, teaching medical students. The students were different now, younger in years but older in other ways. Many had served as medical orderlies before returning to complete their training. They had seen what Fleming had seen. They asked different questions than the students from before the war. One morning in early 1919, a student named Morrison stopped Fleming after a lecture. "Sir, about the antiseptics. In France, we were told carbolic was the best available, but you said—" The young man hesitated, uncertain how directly he could contradict the established protocol. "I said it kills tissue as effectively as it kills bacteria," Fleming finished. "That's correct. Did you observe this yourself?" "Yes, sir. I saw wounds that should have healed. The damage wasn't that extensive. But after the carbolic treatment—" Morrison stopped again, wrestling with the cognitive dissonance between what he'd been taught and what he'd witnessed. Fleming felt a kinship with this young man that he rarely felt with anyone. The literature supports carbolic's use. The theory is sound. In practice, the outcomes are often poor. This suggests the theory is incomplete. Then what should we use instead? "I don't know," Fleming said, and the honesty of it felt both liberating and crushing. That's the question I'm trying to answer. But something had shifted in him. His colleagues noticed it. Where before he had been content with routine work, methodical and careful, but not particularly ambitious, now he seemed to be looking for something. He spent hours staring at bacterial cultures under the microscope, not analyzing, searching. His workbench accumulated specimens that others would have discarded, cultures that had grown beyond their experimental window, contaminated plates that should have been sterilized and reused. Fleming's section of the laboratory began to look less like a professional research space and more like a naturalist's collection of curiosities. "Fleming, for God's sake, throw some of this away," Wright said one afternoon, surveying the cluttered bench with undisguised distaste. "How can you find anything in this chaos?" "I'm not looking for what I filed," Fleming replied. "I'm looking for what I didn't expect." Wright, to his credit, understood this. He was a researcher himself, and while his methods were more orderly than Fleming's, he recognized the value of patient observation. Just don't let the dean see this. He already thinks bacteriologists are one step above alchemists. In 1921 he found something small, not the answer, but a clue. Fleming had a cold. This detail matters more than it seems. He had a cold, and like any bacteriologist with a cold, he couldn't help but wonder what was in his own mucus. The question was almost automatic, the same way a chemist might wonder about the composition of a new substance or a physicist might calculate the trajectory of a thrown ball. So he did what came naturally. He took a sample, he cultured it. He grew whatever bacteria were present and observed what happened. It was a Thursday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for what appeared on the culture plate. Fleming had prepared several plates, streaking his mucus across the growth medium in careful lines, expecting to see the usual respiratory bacteria that colonize the human nose and throat during infection: Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, perhaps some Haemophilus. Instead, he saw clearings. The bacteria died, not all of them, not immediately, but there was a clear zone around the mucus sample where bacteria would not grow. Something in his own bodily fluids was killing bacteria. Fleming stared at this result for a long time, the way a man might stare at a door that had opened onto a room he hadn't known existed. He tested tears, same result. He tested saliva, same result. He isolated the active substance and named it lysozyme, an enzyme, a protein that could break down bacterial cell walls, present in tears, mucus, saliva, a natural defense mechanism that every human body produced constantly. This was remarkable. This was what he'd been searching for, a substance that could kill bacteria without damaging tissue. It was right there, in his own body, doing its work invisibly every moment of every day. Fleming worked on lysozyme with an intensity that surprised even himself. He recruited an assistant, V.D. Allison, a young researcher with better hands for the delicate extraction work. Together they purified lysozyme, characterized its properties, tested its spectrum of antibacterial activity. "We could publish this," Allison said one evening, reviewing their accumulated data. "This is significant, Fleming, a natural antibacterial protein. The medical journals would—" "Look at what it doesn't kill," Fleming interrupted, pointing to their test results. Streptococcus pyogenes, Staphylococcus aureus, pneumococcus, all the dangerous pathogens, all resistant. Allison studied the data more carefully. Fleming was right. Lysozyme was effective against relatively harmless bacteria, the environmental organisms that rarely caused serious disease. Against the bacteria that actually killed people, it was useless. He published his findings anyway. The paper appeared in the Proceedings of the Royal Society in May 1922. It was thorough, well documented, clear in its presentation. Fleming described lysozyme's properties, its distribution in bodily fluids, its mechanism of action. The medical community responded with a collective shrug. Lysozyme killed bacteria, yes, but only weak ones. The dangerous pathogens that caused deadly infections were resistant. It was a curiosity, a scientific footnote. Fleming was disappointed but not surprised. He had learned in France that the things doctors needed most were often the things they valued least. But lysozyme taught him something crucial. It taught him that substances existed which could kill bacteria without destroying human tissue. Nature had already solved the problem he was looking for. Somewhere in the biological world there was a chemical that could do what carbolic acid could not. Kill the infection, spare the patient. He just had to find it. 7 years passed. Fleming's life acquired a domestic rhythm that seemed at odds with his wartime experience. His wife Sarah, the Irish nurse he'd married in 1915, managed their household with the same efficiency she'd once brought to hospital wards. They had met during the war, though not at Fleming's station in Boulogne. Sarah had worked in a London hospital treating soldiers returned from France. She had seen the same infections Fleming had seen, witnessed the same failures of treatment, understood the same frustrations. This shared knowledge created a bond between them that required few words. Their son Robert was born in 1924, a healthy child who would grow up unaware of how close his father had come to death during the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919. Fleming had survived that plague as he had survived the war, through a combination of luck and perhaps some innate resistance that he would spend years trying to understand in his laboratory work. Fleming commuted to St. Mary's every day, worked his shifts, came home. The routine was comforting after the chaos of war. The number 19 bus from Chelsea to Paddington, then a short walk to the hospital. the same faces in the laboratory, the same rhythms of teaching, research, administrative duties. To an outside observer, he was a middle-aged bacteriologist living an unremarkable professional life. But those who knew him well saw something else, a restlessness, an intensity behind the quiet manner. Fleming was waiting for something, though he might not have been able to articulate what. He read voraciously, not just medical journals, but chemistry texts, reports from other fields, anything that might offer a new perspective on the problem of bacterial infection. The Fleming household occupied a modest home in Chelsea, close enough to the hospital for a reasonable commute, but far enough to feel separate from the medical world. Sarah had decorated it with the practicality of a woman who had seen too much chaos to tolerate it in her private space. Everything had its place. Everything was clean, ordered, maintained. Fleming found the contrast between his laboratory and his home almost jarring. At work, his bench was a landscape of controlled chaos, old cultures, ongoing experiments, specimens in various states of analysis. At home, Sarah would tolerate no such disorder. Books were shelved, papers were filed. Even young Robert's toys were organized by type and size. "You live in two different worlds," Sarah told him once, watching him meticulously clean his shoes before entering the house. "At work, you're comfortable in disorder. At home, you conform to order. Which is the real you?" Fleming considered this. "Both. I need the disorder to see what I'm not expecting. I need the order to know I haven't missed anything." Sarah smiled at that, one of her rare, full smiles. "You're fortunate you married a nurse. Anyone else would think you mad." But in the laboratory, he was still searching. He had developed certain habits that his colleagues found eccentric. He rarely threw anything away. Old petri dishes would sit on his bench for weeks growing things that should have been discarded. He claimed he was studying how bacterial cultures aged, how they changed over time. His workspace was cluttered, layered with the sediment of experiments that had ended but not been cleared away. Fleming's midden heap, one of the younger researchers called it, not entirely fondly. The mess was becoming legendary within the department. Students would dare each other to count the stacked plates on his bench. The tally changed daily but was never below 30. Wright defended him, though not without exasperation. "Fleming sees things others miss because he looks at what others discard. Yes, it's untidy. Yes, it drives me to distraction. But I've learned to trust his eye." In September 1928, he returned from a vacation. The date is disputed. Some sources say September 3rd, others say September 28th. Fleming himself gave different dates in different accounts. This uncertainty should bother us more than it does. The exact moment when the most important medical discovery of the 20th century occurred is unknown. What we do know is this: Fleming had been growing Staphylococcus bacteria before he left for his vacation in Scotland. The petri dishes sat on his bench while he was away, undisturbed, exposed to the air of the laboratory. The weather in London that September had been unusual. Warm at the beginning of the month, then suddenly cold as an unexpected cold front moved through, then warm again as summer reasserted itself. Temperature fluctuations that would normally be irrelevant to laboratory work, but which in this case created the precise conditions necessary for what happened next. The cool period allowed the mold to establish itself before the bacteria began their rapid growth phase. When he returned, one of the dishes was contaminated. A mold had grown on it. This was not unusual. Contamination was the bane of bacteriology. Every researcher dealt with it constantly. The normal response was to curse mildly, discard the ruined culture, start again. Fleming picked up the dish to throw it away. His hand was already moving toward the disposal bin, the motion automatic, performed thousands of times before. Then he paused. Then he looked closer. Then he saw something that shouldn't exist. Around the mold colony, the bacteria had died, not slowly, not partially. There was a clear zone, several centimeters wide, where the bacterial culture had dissolved, disappeared. The mold was producing something that killed Staphylococcus, killed it at a distance, killed it completely. Fleming stared at this for a long time. The laboratory around him continued its normal rhythms, technicians preparing media, students examining slides, the constant low-grade activity of a working research facility. He stood motionless, holding a petri dish that would change the world, and nobody noticed. Later, when the story was retold, someone would claim, he said, "That's funny." There's no evidence he said this. No contemporaneous account records those words, but whether or not he spoke them, the sentiment captures something true. This was funny, in the sense that it was unexpected, in the sense that it violated everything he thought he knew about how antibacterial substances worked. Lysozyme had required direct contact, antiseptics required application to the site, but this mold was killing bacteria from a distance. It was secreting something that diffused through the agar medium and destroyed bacterial cells it never touched. "Craddock," Fleming called out, not looking up from the dish. "Come look at this." Stuart Craddock, his assistant, approached with the mild reluctance of a man who had learned that Fleming's "look at this" could mean anything from a genuinely interesting finding to another eccentric observation about bacterial pigmentation. "What am I looking at?" Craddock asked. "Clear zone around the mold. See it?" Craddock saw it. "Contamination. Happens all the time. I'll prepare a fresh culture." "No," Fleming said quietly. "Don't discard this. I want to understand what's happening here." He didn't throw the dish away. He took a sample of the mold. He grew more. He began to test what it could do. The next few weeks became a period of focused intensity that Fleming's colleagues would later describe with a mixture of awe and confusion. He was normally methodical, patient, willing to let experiments develop at their own pace. But with the mold, he worked with almost frantic energy, as if afraid the discovery might evaporate if he didn't capture it quickly enough. The next few weeks revealed properties that seemed almost too good to be true. The mold, which he identified as a species of penicillium, the same genus that grows on bread, produced a substance that killed a wide range of dangerous bacteria: Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Pneumococcus, the organisms that caused wound infections, pneumonia, meningitis, all of them susceptible. He tested it against culture after culture, building a systematic inventory of what the substance could kill. Each positive result felt like a small miracle. Here was a bacterium that carbolic acid would kill, yes, but only while also killing tissue. The mold substance killed it cleanly, leaving surrounding material unharmed. But here was the critical part, the part that mattered more than anything. The substance didn't kill white blood cells. Fleming tested it on human immune cells and found them unharmed. He tested it on animals and found no toxicity. This was the thing he'd been looking for since France, a substance that could kill bacteria without destroying tissue, a substance that worked with the body's defenses instead of against them. He called it penicillin, after the mold that produced it. The naming was characteristically simple, reflecting Fleming's straightforward scientific approach. No dramatic announcement, no claim of revolutionary discovery, no attempt to attach his own name to the substance, just a practical label for a substance he was studying, penicillin, from penicillium, obvious, functional, memorable, a name that would become one of the most important words in medical history. Now we arrive at the part of the story that makes no sense. The part that, even knowing how it ends, seems impossible to believe. Fleming published his findings in 1929. He wrote a careful, detailed paper describing penicillin's antibacterial properties. He submitted it to the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. It was accepted, it was published, and then it was almost completely ignored. The paper appeared in June 1929 under the title On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of bee influenzae. Even the title suggested Fleming saw penicillin primarily as a laboratory tool, something useful for isolating specific bacteria by killing everything else. Over the next decade, Fleming's paper was cited fewer than 10 times. No pharmaceutical company expressed interest. No clinician asked for samples to test on patients. Even Fleming's own colleagues at St. Mary's showed minimal enthusiasm. The discovery that would eventually save hundreds of millions of lives was received with a yawn. Why? This question haunts the history of penicillin. Why did the medical community, faced with evidence that a non-toxic antibacterial substance existed, simply shrug and move on? Part of the answer lies in what Fleming didn't do. He tested penicillin topically as a surface antiseptic. He soaked bandages in it. He used it to isolate specific bacteria in cultures by killing everything else. He found it useful in the laboratory, but he never tested it systemically. He never injected it into infected animals. He never attempted to treat internal infections. Why not? Again, we have to speculate, because Fleming left no clear record of his reasoning. The most likely explanation is that he assumed penicillin would break down too quickly in the body. It was notoriously unstable. It lost potency when exposed to heat, light, or pH changes. Fleming and his assistants, Stuart Craddock and Frederick Ridley, tried to purify it in 1929 and failed. The substance was too fragile, too chemically complex. They couldn't isolate it in a stable form. The purification attempts took place over several months in late 1929 and early 1930. Ridley, who had more chemistry training than Fleming, led the effort. They tried precipitation methods, extraction techniques, every approach available with the equipment they had. "It's degrading faster than we can isolate it," Ridley reported after one particularly frustrating week. "The moment we start to concentrate it, it loses activity. By the time we have anything approaching a pure sample, it's nearly inert." Fleming examined the latest attempt, a small vial of yellowish liquid that represented days of work. How much activity remains? Perhaps 20% of the original, and that's under ideal storage conditions, room temperature, and it's gone in hours. This was damning. A medicine that degraded before you could purify it, that lost potency at room temperature, that couldn't survive the chemical processes necessary to isolate it. How could such a substance ever be practically useful? So Fleming categorized it as a useful laboratory tool but not a practical medicine. He kept the mold alive, maintaining the culture with the same care he might have given a rare botanical specimen. Every few months he would transfer it to fresh medium, ensuring the strain remained viable. He grew new batches occasionally, providing samples to researchers who requested them. He mentioned it in lectures, always carefully, always with appropriate scientific caution. But he didn't push. He didn't insist. He didn't campaign for further research or clinical trials. He let it sit on the shelf of scientific history as a curious footnote, nothing more. The reasons for this passivity are complex and worth examining. Fleming was not lazy. He continued publishing research on other topics throughout the 1930s. He was not stupid. He understood penicillin's potential better than almost anyone. He was not uncaring. His wartime experience had left him deeply committed to reducing the suffering caused by bacterial infection. So why didn't he fight for penicillin? Part of the answer lies in the scientific culture of the time. Bacteriologists were not expected to develop treatments. That was the work of pharmaceutical chemists, clinical researchers, commercial laboratories. Fleming had done his part by making the observation and publishing it. The next steps were someone else's responsibility. Part of the answer lies in institutional constraints. St. Mary's was not equipped for the kind of large-scale purification and clinical testing that penicillin would require. Wright, Fleming's mentor, was skeptical. The British pharmaceutical industry showed no interest. Without institutional support, what could one bacteriologist do? Part of the answer lies in Fleming's personality. He was fundamentally a modest man. He believed in the data, not in salesmanship. If penicillin was as important as it seemed, others would recognize that importance. If they didn't, perhaps he was wrong about its significance. This humility, which in other contexts would be admirable, here became a tragic flaw. But perhaps the deepest answer lies in something Fleming himself might not have fully understood: the traumatic weight of having been right before and being ignored. His 1917 paper on antiseptics had shown that standard treatments were ineffective or harmful. He had published careful research with photographic evidence demonstrating that carbolic acid was making wound infections worse. And nothing had changed. The paper was filed, the protocols continued, the soldiers continued dying. When his penicillin paper met with similar indifference, maybe Fleming simply accepted it as confirmation of what he already knew, that the medical establishment was not interested in challenging orthodoxy, that careful research could be published and ignored, that being right did not mean being listened to. While he did this, people died, millions of them, from infections that penicillin could have cured, from pneumonia, from sepsis, from infected wounds, from childbed fever. They died in hospitals, in their homes, in the streets. They died because the substance that could save them existed but wasn't being used. Consider just 1 year, 1935, 6 years after Fleming's publication. In that single year, in Britain alone, bacterial pneumonia killed approximately 40,000 people. Puerperal fever killed over 2,000 women in childbirth. Scarlet fever, meningitis, and other streptococcal infections killed thousands more. Every single one of these deaths could have been prevented with penicillin. The drug existed. The knowledge existed. But the two facts never connected. This is the mystery that has to haunt us as we go forward, not how penicillin was discovered. That part is documented, but how penicillin was almost lost, how humanity came within a hair's breadth of discarding its most powerful medical tool because one man didn't see its full potential and nobody else cared enough to look. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's really consider what it means. The year is 1935, 6 years after Fleming's publication. Penicillin exists, the knowledge of penicillin exists, published, available. And yet children are still dying of scarlet fever. Women are still dying in childbirth from bacterial infections. Men are still losing limbs to gangrene. The answer is sitting in a laboratory in London, in a culture flask, alive and potent and completely forgotten. What does this tell us about how discovery actually works? About the gap between finding something and understanding what you've found? About the infrastructure required to turn scientific knowledge into medical reality? Fleming was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He didn't have the expertise to purify complex organic molecules. St. Mary's Hospital had excellent bacteriology facilities, but limited biochemistry resources. Almroth Wright, Fleming's mentor and the director of the department, was skeptical of chemical approaches to fighting infection. Wright believed in vaccines, in training the immune system. He thought chemicals were crude, non-specific, dangerous. This was the institutional culture Fleming worked within. Wright's skepticism was rooted in experience. He had seen the damage caused by overzealous use of antiseptics during the war. He had published his own papers showing that chemical treatments often impaired natural healing. When Fleming showed him penicillin's properties, Wright's response was measured. Interesting, Fleming. Useful for culture work, certainly. But as a treatment? The body's own defenses are more reliable than any chemical. Focus on understanding immunity, not on finding new ways to poison bacteria. This wasn't dismissiveness. This was Wright's genuine scientific philosophy, earned through decades of research. But it created an environment where penicillin's therapeutic potential was never seriously explored. but there's more to it than resources and institutional bias. There's something about Fleming himself that we need to understand. He was not a dynamic personality. He was quiet, reserved, uncomfortable with self-promotion. He was a superb laboratory technician but a poor speaker. His lectures were described as dry, his manner as diffident. When his penicillin paper was met with indifference, he didn't fight. He didn't insist. He noted the lack of interest and moved on to other work. This might seem like weakness, like a failure of imagination or will. But there's another way to read it. Fleming was a product of his scientific culture, a culture that valued careful observation over speculation, that discouraged exaggeration, that punished self-promotion. He had made his observation, he had published his data. The rest in the scientific worldview of the 1920s and 1930s was up to others. If they didn't see the value, perhaps the value wasn't there. Except the value was there. Absolutely, undeniably. The value was there and the world was bleeding out while it went unnoticed. In 1938, a young biochemist named Ernst Boris Chain was working at Oxford University under the pathologist Howard Florey. Chain was reading old scientific papers, looking for interesting problems. He came across Fleming's 1929 paper on penicillin. It caught his attention for a specific reason. Penicillin was an enzyme-like substance that destroyed bacteria. Chain was interested in antibacterial enzymes. He thought studying penicillin might reveal something about how these enzymes worked. Chain's background was unusual. Born in Berlin in 1906, Jewish, he had fled Nazi Germany in 1933 as the political situation became increasingly dangerous for Jews in academic positions. He arrived in England with little money, limited connections, uncertain future prospects, but excellent training in biochemistry from the Friedrich Wilhelm University. He spoke English with a heavy German accent that never quite faded, a constant reminder of the world he had been forced to leave behind. He was brilliant, intense, passionate about science in a way that sometimes made his English colleagues uncomfortable. Where British researchers tended toward understatement and reserved discussion, Chain argued loudly, challenged assumptions directly, refused to accept conclusions without rigorous proof. He attacked problems with an energy that seemed almost aggressive, working long hours, demanding the same commitment from collaborators, intolerant of what he saw as lazy thinking. Some found him difficult. Florey, more diplomatic by nature, sometimes had to smooth over conflicts that Chain's directness created. But Florey also recognized Chain's genius, his ability to see through complexity to essential mechanisms, his refusal to accept defeat when experiments failed. When he found Fleming's paper, he saw not a laboratory curiosity but a biochemical puzzle. What was penicillin's molecular structure? How did it work? Could it be purified? Could it be synthesized? These were the questions that interested him, the intellectual challenges that drove his research. He showed the paper to Florey. Florey was interested for a different reason. He was interested in antibacterial substances in general, as part of a broader program studying natural defenses against infection. Penicillin seemed worth investigating. Howard Florey was Australian, trained in England, methodical, where Chain was impulsive, diplomatic, where Chain was direct. He ran his laboratory with careful attention to resource allocation, to maintaining good relationships with funding sources, to building collaborative teams. He was, in many ways, everything Fleming was not: ambitious, strategic, able to navigate institutional politics. They had no idea they were about to change medicine forever. They thought they were pursuing a minor research question. Chain tried to purify penicillin using methods unavailable to Fleming a decade earlier. New techniques in biochemistry had emerged in the intervening years: freeze-drying, improved chromatography, better understanding of pH effects on organic molecules. Chain had access to better equipment, better training, better theoretical frameworks. The work was painstaking. Chain would later describe those months as the most frustrating of his scientific career. Penicillin remained maddeningly unstable, degrading almost as quickly as he could isolate it. But he persisted with the manic energy that characterized all his work. In 1940, he succeeded. He isolated penicillin in a relatively pure form. It was still unstable, still difficult to work with, but he had it. A brown powder that dissolved in water and killed bacteria with remarkable efficiency. Florey immediately saw what Fleming had missed. This wasn't a laboratory curiosity. This was a weapon. If penicillin could be produced in quantity, if it could be stabilized enough to inject, it could treat systemic infections. It could save lives on a scale that no previous medical intervention had approached. "We need to test this in animals," Florey said, examining Chain's purified sample. "Living animals, systemic infection, see if it works the way the in vitro tests suggest." Chain understood the implications immediately. If it works, we've found something that could change everything," Florey finished. They tested it on mice first. 8 mice, infected with Streptococcus bacteria. 4 received penicillin. 4 received nothing. The 4 untreated mice died within 16 hours. The 4 treated mice lived. The experiment took place on May 25, 1940. Florey and Chain stayed in the laboratory through the night, monitoring the mice. As the untreated animals sickened and died, the treated ones remained active, healthy, showing no signs of infection. "It works," Chain said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It actually works." Florey and Chain stared at the surviving mice the same way Fleming had stared at the moldy petri dish 11 years earlier. Except Florey and Chain understood immediately what they were looking at. They understood that they were holding the key to one of humanity's oldest enemies. Death by infection, death from invisible organisms that could turn a small cut into a fatal wound, death that came despite prayer, despite care, despite every medical intervention then available. Penicillin made that kind of death obsolete. But there was a problem. Actually, there were multiple problems, each one nearly insurmountable. First, penicillin was extraordinarily difficult to produce. The yields were tiny. The penicillium mold had to be grown in large quantities under specific conditions. The penicillin it produced had to be extracted, purified, concentrated. Every step involved losses. To treat a single patient required hundreds of liters of mold culture. Florey did the calculations. Based on their current production methods, treating one human patient for 1 week would require the full output of their laboratory for 2 months. This was absurd. This was impossible. They needed industrial-scale production, and they needed it quickly. Second, Britain was at war. It was 1940. The Battle of Britain was raging. Resources were scarce. Industrial capacity was devoted to weapons production. The idea of building a facility to mass-produce a new, unproven medicine seemed absurd. Third, nobody knew if it would actually work in humans. The mouse experiment was promising, but mice were not people. Dosage, toxicity, effectiveness, all of this remained unknown. Florey pushed anyway. He scraped together funding from every source he could find. The Rockefeller Foundation provided some support. The Medical Research Council contributed a small grant. Private donations from wealthy patrons who believed in the work added more. But it was never enough. They were trying to do industrial-scale work with academic-scale resources. He converted laboratory space, turning every available room into a mold-growing facility. He recruited every available person to grow mold, not just scientists, but secretaries, janitors, anyone who could follow instructions. They worked in shifts, around the clock, tending to the mold cultures with the devotion of farmers nurturing a crucial crop. They used bedpans, milk bottles, pie tins, biscuit tins, anything that could hold culture medium. The image is almost comical. One of the greatest medical breakthroughs in history being developed in repurposed hospital bedpans. But there was nothing comical about the desperate urgency driving the work. They knew penicillin worked. They knew people were dying. Every day of delay was measured in preventable deaths. Norman Heatley, a biochemist in Florey's team, designed an improved extraction system using ceramic containers and a clever arrangement of tubes that allowed continuous processing. The apparatus looked like something a particularly ingenious plumber might create, cobbled together from spare parts and creative improvisation. But it worked. Production increased from milligrams per week to grams. Heatley also solved the critical problem of measuring penicillin concentration. Previous methods had been crude and time-consuming. Heatley developed a rapid assay using bacterial cultures, simple, elegant, reproducible. This allowed them to track penicillin levels throughout the production process, identifying where losses occurred and optimizing each step. The team worked obsessively. 18-hour days were common. Sleep happened in chairs, grabbed between batch processing runs. Meals were irregular, often forgotten. The laboratory became their world, and the world beyond, the war, the bombing, the normal rhythms of life, faded into background noise. But grams were not enough. Not nearly enough. To treat even one patient required more penicillin than they could produce in a week. And there were thousands, millions of potential patients. The gap between what they had and what they needed was unbridgeable. By early 1941, they had enough penicillin to try it on a human patient. The patient was a police constable named Albert Alexander, 43 years old. He had scratched his face on a rose thorn. The scratch had become infected. The infection had spread. He had abscesses on his face, his lungs, his scalp. He was dying. Albert Alexander had been ill for months. The infection had started in December 1940, a small scratch while he was pruning roses in his garden. By January, the scratch had become an abscess. By February, the infection had spread to his eyes, his scalp, his lungs. He was septic, feverish, barely conscious. The doctors at Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford had done everything possible. Sulfur drugs, which sometimes worked for bacterial infections, had failed. Surgical drainage of the abscesses provided temporary relief, but no cure. Alexander was dying, and everyone knew it. When Florey approached Alexander's physicians about trying penicillin, the response was immediate. Yes. They had nothing else to offer. An experimental treatment was better than watching a patient die with no intervention. Florey administered the first dose on February 12, 1941. The effect was rapid and dramatic. Alexander's fever dropped. The infections began to clear. Within days, he was improving visibly. He became lucid, spoke to his wife, asked for food. The doctors were euphoric. It was working. Penicillin was working in a human patient with a severe infection. "This is remarkable," Alexander's attending physician said, reviewing the chart. "I've never seen an infection respond this quickly. What's the dosing schedule?" "Every 3 hours," Florey said. "We need to maintain steady blood levels." "And how much do you have?" Florey's expression answered before his words did. "Enough for 10 days, maybe." "Maybe. If we can maintain production at current rates, if we don't lose too much in extraction, if the batch quality remains consistent." The conditional nature of the answer was ominous. They were trying to save a man's life with a substance they could barely produce, using methods that were experimental at every stage. Then the penicillin ran out. They had used every drop they had. They had even collected Alexander's urine and extracted penicillin from it, recycling the drug because they had so little. But it wasn't enough. The infection returned. Albert Alexander died on March 15, 1941. He died not because penicillin didn't work. He died because there wasn't enough of it. Florey stood by Alexander's bed after the death, staring at the chart that documented both penicillin's triumph and its failure. The temperature curve showed dramatic improvement, then gradual decline as the drug ran out, then spike upward again as the infection returned, a map of hope and futility. "We saved him," Chain said quietly. "For almost 3 weeks we saved him. The penicillin worked. And then we watched him die because we couldn't make enough of it," Florey replied. That's not success. That's torture. This is the moment that defines penicillin's history. The moment when the gap between what was possible and what was available became a matter of life and death. Florey and Chain had proven that penicillin could cure infections in humans, but proof meant nothing without supply, and supply required industrial-scale production, and industrial-scale production required investment, infrastructure, coordination across institutions and nations. Britain couldn't do it alone. The country was fighting for survival. German bombs were falling on London nightly. There was no capacity to build penicillin production facilities. Florey made a desperate decision. He travelled to the United States in June 1941. He brought his data, his cultures, his findings. He met with officials from the Rockefeller Foundation, which had funded some of his work. He approached American pharmaceutical companies. He begged them to help. The meetings were frustrating. American pharmaceutical executives were interested but cautious. Penicillin was unproven at scale. The production challenges were immense. The profit potential was unclear, especially since the substance couldn't be patented. It was a natural product. Why invest millions in something that might not work commercially? But it does work, Florey insisted in meeting after meeting. We've proven it works in humans. The only question is production. The only question, one executive replied, is whether we can produce it at a cost that makes sense. Your methods are laboratory scale. Scaling that up by a factor of 10,000. That's not just an engineering problem, that's an economic gamble. The American response was cautious at first. Penicillin was unproven at scale. The production challenges were immense. The profit potential was unclear, especially since the substance couldn't be patented. It was a natural product. Why invest millions in something that might not work commercially? Then Pearl Harbor happened. December 7, 1941, the United States entered the war. Suddenly, the military application of penicillin became obvious. Soldiers would be wounded, wounds would become infected. Penicillin could save them. The US government threw its weight behind production. Pharmaceutical companies were ordered to cooperate. Resources were allocated. The War Production Board made penicillin a priority. What followed was one of the great industrial achievements of the 20th century. Within 2 years, penicillin production went from laboratory-scale batches measured in milligrams to industrial-scale production measured in tons. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a moldy cantaloupe from a Peoria, Illinois market. A researcher at the Northern Regional Research Laboratory, part of the Department of Agriculture, found that a mold growing on this discarded fruit produced penicillin at 20 times the rate of Fleming's original strain. Further mutation and selection pushed yields even higher. New strains of penicillium were developed that produced higher yields. New extraction methods were invented. New purification techniques were refined. Chemical engineers solved problems that had seemed insurmountable in Oxford's academic laboratory. Pharmaceutical companies competed and cooperated simultaneously. Pfizer developed deep tank fermentation methods. Merck optimized extraction processes. Squibb improved purification. The companies shared findings while racing to increase production. It was industrial science at its most effective, competitive pressure driving innovation, while wartime necessity ensured cooperation. By 1943, there was enough penicillin to treat wounded soldiers. By 1944, there was enough for civilian use. By 1945, penicillin was available in pharmacies. The impact was immediate and staggering. Infections that had been death sentences became minor inconveniences. Pneumonia, syphilis, gonorrhea, meningitis, sepsis. All of them suddenly treatable. The transformation was almost miraculous in its speed and completeness. Surgical outcomes improved dramatically because post-operative infections could be controlled. Procedures that had been too dangerous to attempt, complex abdominal surgeries, cardiac operations, organ transplants became possible because surgeons no longer feared that their patients would die from post-operative sepsis. The entire field of surgery expanded into territories that had been inaccessible. Childbirth became safer because puerperal fever could be cured. Women who would have died within days of delivering a healthy baby now survived with a simple course of penicillin. Maternal mortality rates dropped by over 90% in countries where penicillin was available. An entire category of tragedy, the orphaned newborn, the husband losing his wife in what should have been a moment of joy, became rare instead of common. Injured soldiers survived wounds that would have killed them in previous wars. A soldier hit by shrapnel in the Pacific Theatre, a wound that in World War I would have led to gangrene and death, could now be treated with penicillin and sulfanilamide, cleaned and closed, and the soldier returned to duty within weeks. Military medicine was revolutionized not just by penicillin but by the new understanding of what was possible. Childhood changed. Before penicillin, every parent lived with the background fear that a child's sore throat might be scarlet fever, that a cut might become infected, that a fever might be the start of meningitis. These fears didn't disappear. Children still got sick, but they were no longer death sentences. A sick child meant a visit to the doctor, a prescription for penicillin, recovery within days. The existential terror that had characterized parenting for all of human history was suddenly, remarkably diminished. The elderly benefited perhaps most of all. Pneumonia had been called the old man's friend because it offered a relatively quick death for those whose bodies were failing in other ways. But with penicillin, pneumonia became treatable. People who might have died at 70 lived to 80. Those who might have died at 80 lived to 90. Lifespans increased not just because of better nutrition and sanitation, but because bacterial infections no longer cut short lives that had years or decades remaining. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. In World War I, the war Fleming had served in, more soldiers died from infected wounds than from the wounds themselves. The statistics are sobering. For every 100 men wounded seriously enough to require evacuation from the front, approximately 15 died from wound infections. Not from the initial injury, from what came after, from the invisible bacteria that colonized damaged tissue and spread despite every intervention available. In World War II, the death rate from infected wounds dropped by more than 80%. For every 100 wounded soldiers, perhaps 2 or 3 died from infection. The rest survived, returned home, lived full lives that would have been cut short by gangrene or sepsis or pneumonia in the previous generation's war. Think about what this means in human terms. A soldier wounded on D-Day, pulled from the beaches of Normandy with a leg wound that would certainly have killed him in 1918, instead received penicillin, recovered in a field hospital, and returned home to his family. Multiplied across millions of soldiers, across both sides of the conflict, across every theatre of war, the number of lives saved is almost incalculable. Penicillin didn't just save individual lives, it changed the baseline mortality rate for entire categories of medical conditions. Diseases that had killed for all of human history suddenly became treatable. The effect rippled through every aspect of society, changing what was possible, what was survivable, what parents feared, and what doctors could promise. And through all of this, Alexander Fleming watched from London. The quiet bacteriologist who had almost thrown away a contaminated petri dish, who had published a paper nobody read, who had kept a mold culture alive for 11 years without understanding its full potential. He watched as Florey and Chain turned his discovery into a medical revolution. He watched as American factories produced tons of a substance he had measured in test tubes. He watched as his name became synonymous with one of humanity's greatest achievements. The question is, how did he feel about it? We have some clues. Fleming was knighted in 1944. He shared the Nobel Prize with Florey and Chain in 1945. He gave hundreds of lectures around the world. He became a celebrity, one of the most famous scientists alive. Everywhere he went, People thanked him for saving their lives or the lives of their loved ones. He was treated as a hero. The public appearances were grueling. Fleming, who had spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight, now found himself thrust into it constantly. Interviews, lectures, ceremonial functions. Everyone wanted to hear the story of the contaminated petri dish, the accidental discovery, the miracle mold. "Tell us about the moment you discovered penicillin," interviewers would ask, and Fleming would recount the story in his dry, methodical way, stripping it of drama, presenting it as a simple observation that anyone might have made. But there are hints of something more complex beneath the public image. Fleming occasionally made statements suggesting he felt Florey and Chain received insufficient credit. He sometimes said he had invented penicillin, a claim that bothered both Florey and Chain since Fleming had only discovered it. They had developed it into a usable medicine. There was tension between the three men, carefully hidden but definitely present. The tension surfaced most clearly in private correspondence and in carefully worded public statements. Florey, in particular, bristled at the way media coverage focused on Fleming's initial discovery while largely ignoring the years of development work. Fleming found a mold that killed bacteria, Florey wrote to a colleague in 1945. "We turned that observation into a medicine that saves lives. The public sees these as the same thing. They are not the same thing." Fleming also seems to have felt defensive about his failure to pursue penicillin's clinical development in the 1930s. When asked why he hadn't done more with his discovery, he gave various explanations. He lacked resources, he lacked expertise, he hadn't imagined systemic use was possible. These were all true, but they were also rationalizations. The fact remained that he had let penicillin languish for 11 years while people died of treatable infections. Did this haunt him? We don't know. Fleming was not an introspective man, or at least not a publicly introspective one. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't write memoirs exploring his inner life. What we have are his actions and his public statements, and those suggest a man who accepted the role history had given him, hero of medicine, humble discoverer, while privately wrestling with the knowledge that his contribution, however crucial, was incomplete. There's one more piece to this story that we need to examine. It's the piece that brings us full circle, back to France, back to the field hospitals, back to the question of what Fleming was really searching for. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1945, Fleming said something that most people at the time dismissed as overly cautious. He warned that bacteria could develop resistance to penicillin. He warned that misuse of the drug, taking too little, taking it for too short a time, could create strains of bacteria that were immune to its effects. He warned that the miracle cure could become useless if humanity wasn't careful. "The time may come," Fleming said in Stockholm, "when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug make them resistant." The audience listened politely. A few people took notes. Most dismissed it as the kind of theoretical caution that scientists always offered, important to acknowledge but unlikely to matter in practice. Nobody listened. How could they? Penicillin was saving lives by the millions. Resistance was a theoretical problem, a distant possibility. The immediate miracle was too overwhelming to worry about future consequences. But Fleming was right. Of course he was right. He had spent decades studying bacteria. He understood how quickly they evolved, how ruthlessly they adapted to survive. He had seen it in the laboratory. He knew that penicillin resistance wasn't a question of if, but when. The first penicillin-resistant strains appeared within years. By the 1950s, resistant staphylococcus was becoming common in hospitals. By the 1960s, doctors were routinely encountering infections that penicillin couldn't touch. The The pharmaceutical industry responded by developing new antibiotics, more penicillin derivatives, then entirely new classes of antibacterial drugs. For decades, chemistry stayed one step ahead of bacterial evolution. But the gap has been closing. Today, we face bacteria resistant to multiple antibiotics, sometimes to all antibiotics. We face infections that are, once again, untreatable. We are sliding backward toward the pre-penicillin era, where a scratch from a rose thorn can kill you, where surgery carries the risk of fatal infection, where childbirth can be a death sentence. This is Fleming's legacy too, not just the miracle of penicillin, but the warning that accompanied it, the warning that we had been given a gift but not a permanent solution, that bacterial evolution would continue relentless and indifferent, that every use of antibiotics was both a cure and a selective pressure, killing susceptible bacteria and allowing resistant ones to thrive. We are living through the consequence of ignoring that warning. We are watching the antibiotic age end, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow erosion. Fewer and fewer drugs work. More and more infections resist treatment. The medical procedures that penicillin made safe, organ transplants, cancer chemotherapy, major surgery, are becoming dangerous again. And the pipeline of new antibiotics has slowed to a trickle. Pharmaceutical companies have largely abandoned antibiotic research because it's not profitable enough. Antibiotics are used for short periods, not lifelong like treatments for chronic diseases. They go generic quickly. The investment required to develop a new antibiotic doesn't generate enough return, so we are running out of options at the exact moment when bacterial resistance is accelerating. This is the other mystery embedded in Fleming's story, not just how penicillin was nearly lost, but how it's being lost again. How humanity took the most powerful medical tool ever discovered and squandered it through overuse, misuse, and economic short-sightedness. Fleming died in 1955, heart attack, sudden. He was 73 years old. He died at home in London, the city he had moved to as a teenager from rural Scotland, the city where he had spent his entire professional life. The morning of March 11, 1955, was unremarkable. Fleming had been working in his study, reviewing correspondence, planning upcoming lectures. His second wife, Amalia, heard a sound from the study, a chair scraping, something falling. She found him collapsed, unconscious, barely breathing. The doctors came quickly. They tried everything, but there was no saving him. The man who had discovered the substance that saved millions died from a condition that no amount of penicillin could prevent. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, a nearly unprecedented honor for a scientist. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the world. The Spanish government declared a national day of mourning. He had lived long enough to see penicillin transform medicine. He had lived long enough to receive global recognition for his discovery. He had lived long enough to watch bacterial resistance begin to emerge. Whether he understood that he was seeing the beginning of the end, we don't know. What we do know is this: Fleming's story is not a simple story of genius and discovery. It's a story about the gap between seeing and understanding, about the difference between finding something and knowing what you've found, about how institutions shape what science can accomplish, about how close we came to losing penicillin before we had it, and how we're losing it again now that we do. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to that moment in 1928 when Fleming picked up a contaminated petri dish. The standard narrative says he was lucky. The mold spore happened to land on his bacterial culture. He happened to notice it. He happened to investigate instead of discarding it. A series of accidents that led to the most important medical discovery of the century. But this narrative misses something crucial. Fleming had been looking for antibacterial substances for years. He had discovered lysozyme in 1921. He had published research on antiseptics in World War I. He had spent his entire career studying how to kill bacteria without harming tissue. When the mold appeared on his culture, he recognized its significance immediately because he had prepared himself to recognize it. Pasteur said chance favors the prepared mind. Fleming's mind was prepared. The contamination might have been accidental, but his response to it was not. He saw what others would have missed because he had trained himself to see it. But here's the question that should disturb us. If Fleming was prepared, why didn't he do more with what he found? He tested penicillin topically. He used it as a laboratory tool. He published a paper describing its properties. Then he essentially stopped. He didn't push for clinical trials. He didn't demand that pharmaceutical companies investigate it. He didn't shout from the rooftops that he had found a substance that could revolutionize medicine. He noted his discovery and moved on. Was this humility, scientific caution, institutional pressure, limited imagination? We've touched on all these explanations, but none of them fully satisfies. The gap between Fleming's discovery in 1928 and Florey's development in 1940 is a wound in the history of medicine. It's a 12-year period when the answer existed but wasn't used, when millions died unnecessarily, when the knowledge was available but the application was not. What does this gap tell us about how science actually works? About the distance between laboratory discovery and clinical reality? About the infrastructure required to turn knowledge into action? Consider what had to happen for penicillin to go from Fleming's observation to mass production. It required Chain's biochemistry expertise to purify it. It required Florey's vision to see its clinical potential. It required wartime urgency to justify the investment. It required American industrial capacity to scale up production. It required government coordination to allocate resources. It required decades of prior work in bacteriology, chemistry, and medicine to provide the theoretical and practical foundations. Fleming made the initial observation, but that observation alone meant nothing. Discovery is not enough. Development is what matters, and development requires resources, institutions, coordination, and will. Fleming had none of these. He had a good eye and a curious mind, and access to a reasonably equipped laboratory. That was enough to discover penicillin. It was nowhere near enough to make penicillin matter. This is the tragedy embedded in the triumph. The tragedy that the answer to bacterial infection sat in a laboratory for over a decade while people died. The tragedy that it took another war, more death, more suffering, to create the conditions where penicillin could be developed. The tragedy that medical progress is not about discovery alone, but about the much harder work of turning discovery into something useful. And now we're facing a similar gap in reverse. We know that antibiotic resistance is rising. We know that we need new antibiotics. We know that bacterial evolution is outpacing pharmaceutical development. We have the knowledge, we understand the problem, but we lack the will, the resources, the institutional coordination to solve it. We are watching the same pattern repeat. Knowledge without application, understanding without action, awareness without consequence. Fleming warned us in 1945. He stood in Stockholm, accepting the Nobel Prize, and told the world that penicillin could stop working if we weren't careful. The warning was clear. The mechanism was understood. The danger was real. We didn't listen then. We're not listening now. Antibiotics are still overprescribed. They're still used in agriculture to promote animal growth. They're still taken incorrectly, stopped too soon, shared between patients. Every misuse is a chance for bacteria to evolve resistance. Every misuse is a step closer to the post-antibiotic era. There's a deeper pattern here that we need to see. It's a pattern about how humanity relates to its own knowledge. We discovered penicillin and almost lost it through indifference. We developed penicillin and are losing it again through misuse. We understand antibiotic resistance and are failing to act on that understanding. The gap between knowing and doing is not a historical anomaly. It's a structural feature of how we operate. Fleming's life spanned the transition from pre-antibiotic to antibiotic medicine. He was born in 1881 when bacterial infection was a leading cause of death. He died in 1955 when penicillin and its derivatives had made most bacterial infections treatable. He lived through the entire arc of a medical revolution that he had initiated, but he also lived long enough to see the first signs that the revolution was not permanent, that bacteria were adapting, that resistance was emerging, that the miracle cure had an expiration date. Did he despair? Did he rage? Did he accept it as inevitable? We don't know. Fleming was not the kind of man who expressed his inner life publicly. He was Scottish, reserved, shaped by a culture that valued restraint. What we have are his public statements, his lectures, his warnings about resistance. We have the fact that he kept working until the end, that he never fully retired, that he remained engaged with bacteriology even as he became a global celebrity. And maybe that's answer enough. Maybe the fact that he kept working, kept warning, kept trying to make people understand the limits of what they had been given is all we need to know about how he felt. Let's talk about the contamination itself. Let's talk about how that mold spore actually got into Fleming's petri dish, because this detail matters more than the standard story suggests. The standard story says Fleming left a window open, or that his laboratory was messy, or that contamination was just common in bacteriology labs of the era. All of this is true but incomplete. The contamination that led to penicillin's discovery was not random, it was extraordinarily specific. The mold that contaminated Fleming's culture was Penicillium notatum, a relatively rare species. The bacterial culture was Staphylococcus, which penicillin happens to kill effectively. The contamination occurred at a moment when Fleming had stepped away from active work on that particular culture, but before he had discarded it. The temperature fluctuations in London in early September 1928 were such that the mold grew first, then the bacteria, creating the clear zone that Fleming observed. The sequence was critical. The mold needed to establish itself and begin producing penicillin before the bacteria started growing. If the bacteria had grown first, they would have covered the plate before the mold could produce enough penicillin to create the visible clearing. The London weather in September 1928, unseasonably cool, then warm, then cool again, created exactly the right conditions for this sequence. If any of these variables had been different, the discovery doesn't happen. If the mold had been a different species, if the bacteria had been resistant, if Fleming had discarded the culture immediately, if the temperature had stayed consistent. The discovery required a precise alignment of factors that seems, in retrospect, almost impossibly unlikely. This has led some historians to question the standard narrative. Ronald Hare, a colleague of Fleming's, conducted extensive research into the conditions necessary for the discovery and concluded that the contamination could not have happened the way Fleming described it. The variables were too specific. The timeline didn't quite work. Hare suggested that the contamination might have occurred differently, perhaps through a different route, perhaps earlier than Fleming remembered. Fleming's own accounts of the discovery changed slightly over the years. Sometimes he said September 3rd, sometimes September 28th. Sometimes he emphasized the accidental nature. Sometimes he emphasized his observational skills. The inconsistencies are minor but revealing. They suggest that even Fleming wasn't entirely certain about the exact sequence of events. This uncertainty should bother us. The most important medical discovery of the 20th century occurred under conditions that are not entirely clear. The precise mechanism of the contamination is debated. The exact date is unknown. The standard story has been simplified, streamlined, turned into a narrative that fits our expectations about scientific discovery. But real discovery is messier than that. It involves uncertainty, ambiguity, and details that don't quite add up. It involves human memory, which is fallible. It involves narratives that change in the retelling. Fleming discovered penicillin, this much is certain. How exactly it happened we may never know for sure. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the uncertainty at the heart of the discovery mirrors the uncertainty at the heart of Fleming's legacy. He discovered penicillin but didn't develop it. He warned about resistance but couldn't prevent it. He saw the potential but didn't realize it himself. His story is full of gaps, contradictions, and unanswered questions. The human mind wants clean narratives. Lone genius has brilliant insight. Brilliant insight saves millions. Genius receives recognition. Everyone lives happily ever after. We want the story to be simple, but Fleming's story resists simplicity. It's a story about how discovery and development are separate things, about how individual insight requires institutional support, about how the right observation at the right time means nothing without the right context and the right resources, about how even the most important discovery can be ignored if the world isn't ready for it. It's also a story about limits, about how every solution creates new problems, about how bacterial evolution is relentless, about how the gap between what we know and what we do can be unbridgeable. Fleming's wartime experience in France shaped everything that came after. This is not speculation. Fleming himself said this repeatedly in his later lectures. The frustration of watching soldiers die from infected wounds, the inadequacy of available treatments, the realization that antiseptics were often making things worse. This is what drove his search for antibacterial substances. Think about what this means. The discovery that saved hundreds of millions of lives emerged from the trauma of watching thousands die. The solution came from the problem. The answer grew out of the question. Fleming saw death from infection on an industrial scale, and that vision haunted him until he found something that could prevent it. But here's the thing about trauma-driven discovery. It creates both urgency and blind spots. The urgency pushed Fleming to keep looking, to notice what others missed, to recognize penicillin's significance. But it also may have limited his vision. He was looking for something to treat wound infections. He tested penicillin topically because that's how wounds are treated. He didn't think of systemic use because his mental model was shaped by the specific problem he had witnessed. Florey and Chain didn't have that same trauma. They approached penicillin as a biochemical puzzle, not as a solution to a specific medical problem. That distance, paradoxically, allowed them to see possibilities that Fleming had missed. They thought about systemic use because they weren't locked into a particular application. They pursued mass production because they weren't constrained by laboratory-scale thinking. This suggests something important about how innovation actually works. Sometimes the discoverer is the wrong person to develop the discovery. Sometimes fresh eyes are essential. Sometimes the trauma that drives the initial insight becomes a limitation when it's time to expand beyond that insight. Fleming discovered penicillin because of his war experience. He failed to develop it, in part, for the same reason. The trauma that made him see it also made him blind to its full potential. Let's sit with the counterfactual for a moment. What if Fleming had pursued clinical development in the early 1930s? What if he had pushed for trials, demanded resources, collaborated with chemists? The answer is that millions of people would have lived. Millions who died from bacterial infections in the 1930s would have survived. Children with pneumonia, women with childbed fever, men with infected wounds, all treatable, all savable. All dead because the drug that could have saved them existed but wasn't being used. This is the weight that Fleming may have carried in his later years. The knowledge that his failure to act had costs, that his modesty or his caution or his lack of institutional support, or whatever combination of factors prevented him from developing penicillin, had led to preventable deaths. We don't know if he thought this way, we don't know if he blamed himself, but the facts are inescapable. Penicillin existed, people died. The two facts are connected. Of course, it's also possible that Fleming couldn't have developed penicillin in the 1930s, that the institutional support wasn't there, that the biochemistry expertise he needed didn't exist at St. Mary's, that the pharmaceutical industry wasn't interested, that World War II and its urgent military need was actually necessary to create the conditions for development. If that's true, then the deaths in the 1930s weren't preventable. The timeline was inevitable. Penicillin couldn't have been developed earlier because the world wasn't ready for it. But we don't know which of these narratives is true. We don't know if an alternative history was possible. And that uncertainty is its own kind of tragedy. Not knowing whether things could have been different. Not knowing whether the gap between discovery and development was necessary or wasteful. Living with the question but never getting the answer. Fleming's personality adds another layer to this. He was not a self-promoter. He was not aggressive or ambitious in the conventional sense. He did his work quietly, published his results, and expected others to recognize their significance. In some contexts, this is admirable. It's the opposite of the grandstanding scientist who oversells preliminary findings. It's the embodiment of the ideal that data should speak for themselves, but in this context it was catastrophic. Data don't speak for themselves, discoveries don't implement themselves. Medical breakthroughs require advocates. They require people who push, who insist, who refuse to let important findings be ignored. Fleming was not that person. He published his penicillin paper and essentially waited for the world to notice. The world didn't notice, and he didn't force it to notice. Was this a character flaw? Or just a mismatch between his personality and what the moment required? There's no clear answer. Fleming was who he was. A quiet, careful, observant scientist who was brilliant at seeing what others missed, but not equipped to translate that vision into action. The scientific culture of his era reinforced this. Self-promotion was discouraged. Overstatement was punished. The ideal scientist was supposed to present findings and let peers evaluate them. Fleming followed this ideal perfectly, and it almost cost humanity penicillin. This raises uncomfortable questions about how science actually works versus how we think it works. We like to believe that good ideas naturally rise to prominence, that important discoveries are recognized, that the scientific community efficiently identifies and develops valuable findings. Fleming's story demolishes this belief. The most important medical discovery of the century was ignored for 11 years, not because it was wrong, not because the evidence was weak, but because one person lacked the resources and personality to develop it and nobody else cared enough to try. The system failed massively, and millions of people paid with their lives. When Florey and Chain finally did develop penicillin, when the clinical trials in 1941 showed dramatic results, the response was not, "Thank God, someone finally developed this." It was, "Where did this miracle drug come from?" Fleming's 1929 paper was suddenly rediscovered. His name was suddenly famous. The narrative was constructed. Humble Scottish scientist makes accidental discovery, saves the world. Fleming was knighted, he was celebrated, he became the public face of penicillin. But Florey and Chain, who had done the actual work of making penicillin usable, remained relatively obscure. The public didn't understand purification, mass production, or clinical trials. They understood the romantic story of mold on a petri dish. They understood the lone genius narrative. Fleming fit that narrative. Florey and Chain didn't. This bothered Florey especially. He had turned Fleming's observation into a practical medicine. He had done the hard work, the years of labor, the problem-solving required to make penicillin real, and Fleming got the credit. There was a public dispute about this, carefully muted but definitely present. Florey gave interviews pointing out his team's contributions. Fleming made statements about inventing penicillin that were technically false. He had discovered it, not invented it. The Nobel Prize Committee split the award 3 ways, trying to recognize everyone's contributions. But public perception remained fixed. Fleming was the hero of penicillin. This is its own kind of injustice. Not as severe as millions dying from treatable infections, but still meaningful. The people who did the hardest, most important work received the least recognition. The person who made the initial observation, crucial but incomplete, received nearly all the glory. Why? Because we prefer simple stories to complex ones. Because lone genius is a more compelling narrative than institutional collaboration. Because discovery is easier to understand than development. Because a contaminated petri dish is a better story than years of biochemical optimization. Fleming understood this. He was not naive about the gap between his contribution and his recognition. In his later years, he was careful to credit Florey and Chain in his lectures, but he also accepted the accolades. He enjoyed the celebrity. He gave hundreds of talks where he told the story of penicillin's discovery, and while he acknowledged others' contributions, he remained the central figure. Was this ego or just acceptance of a role history had assigned him? Again, we can't know for certain. But the pattern is clear. Fleming discovered penicillin but didn't develop it. He received credit for both. The asymmetry was obvious to everyone involved, but it persisted anyway because it fit the narrative people wanted to believe. Let's return to the resistance question one more time, because this is where Fleming's legacy intersects with our present. When Fleming warned about antibiotic resistance in 1945, he was describing a mechanism he understood deeply. Bacteria reproduce rapidly, millions of generations in a short time. Each generation has a chance of mutation. Most mutations are neutral or harmful, but occasionally a mutation provides an advantage. Resistance to an antibiotic is a massive advantage. Bacteria with that mutation survive. Bacteria without it die. The resistant strain becomes dominant. This is natural selection in its purest form. And it's unstoppable. You cannot use antibiotics without creating selective pressure for resistance. The question is not whether resistance will emerge, but how quickly. Fleming saw this coming. He understood that penicillin's power came with a cost. He understood that every use of the drug was accelerating the day when it would stop working. He tried to warn people. He tried to make them understand that antibiotics were not a permanent solution. Nobody listened. How could they? Penicillin was saving lives. Infections that had been fatal were now curable. The benefit was immediate and obvious. The cost was abstract and distant. Of course, people chose the immediate benefit. But the cost has come due. Today we face bacteria resistant to multiple antibiotics. We face infections that are once again untreatable. We are losing the tools that made modern medicine possible. And the pipeline of new antibiotics has slowed to almost nothing. Why? Because antibiotics are not profitable enough. Because pharmaceutical companies make more money from drugs that treat chronic conditions, drugs that patients take for years. Antibiotics are taken for days. They go generic quickly. The return on investment is poor. So we are running out of options at exactly the moment when we need them most. We know how to make new antibiotics, we have the scientific knowledge, but we lack the economic incentive. The market has failed, and people are dying. This is Fleming's warning coming true, not just the resistance, but the systemic failure. The gap between what we know and what we do, the inability of institutions to respond to slow-moving crises. The prioritization of short-term profit over long-term survival. Fleming saw this pattern in miniature in the 1930s. Penicillin existed, people were dying, the two facts coexisted without connecting. Today we see the same pattern. Solutions exist, people are dying, the two facts coexist without connecting. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme scheme of Fleming's story is one we should find deeply unsettling. There's one more piece we need to examine. It's the question of what Fleming actually thought he had found in 1928. When he first observed the mold-killing bacteria, what did he think he was looking at? The standard narrative says he immediately recognized its medical potential, but the evidence suggests something more complicated. Fleming's initial tests focused on using penicillin as a laboratory tool. He found that it could selectively kill certain bacteria while leaving others alive. This was useful for isolating specific bacterial strains. He used it this way for years. He provided samples to other researchers who wanted to use it for the same purpose. He also tested it topically, soaking bandages in penicillin solutions. He found it effective for treating surface infections. He published this finding, but he didn't pursue it aggressively. He didn't conduct extensive trials. He noted the result and moved on. What he apparently didn't think was that penicillin could be injected to treat systemic infections. This is the crucial blind spot. He had found a substance that killed bacteria without harming tissue, but he assumed it would break down too quickly in the body to be useful internally. Why did he assume this? Partly because penicillin was unstable, it lost potency rapidly, partly because his mental model was focused on topical application, but also perhaps because he had learned from lysozyme. Remember lysozyme, the antibacterial enzyme Fleming had discovered in 1921. Lysozyme also killed bacteria. It was non-toxic to human tissue. It seemed promising, but it only worked on relatively weak bacteria. The dangerous pathogens were resistant. Fleming had learned that natural antibacterial substances had limits. So when he found penicillin, maybe he assumed it would have similar limits. Maybe he thought it would be useful, but not revolutionary. Maybe his experience with lysozyme created expectations that penicillin then exceeded, but only after Florey and Chain tested it in ways Fleming hadn't imagined. This is speculation. We don't have Fleming's private thoughts. We have his actions, his publications, his public statements, and those suggest a man who found something interesting, but didn't realize he had found something transformative. This is human. This is normal. Most discoveries are incremental. Most findings are minor additions to existing knowledge. Fleming had no reason to think penicillin was different. He had no way to know that this particular observation would change medicine forever. Except that he did know, on some level he must have known. He kept the mold alive for 11 years. He mentioned it in lectures. He gave samples to anyone who asked. He never forgot about it, never discarded it, never moved on completely. So maybe he knew it was important, but didn't know how important. Maybe he sensed its potential without fully understanding it. Maybe he was waiting for someone else to see what he had seen and take it further. Or maybe he just didn't know what to do next. Maybe he hit the limits of his expertise and his institutional resources and simply stopped, not out of disinterest, but out of helplessness. The uncertainty here is maddening. We're talking about one man's thoughts in the late 1920s and early 1930s. We have fragmentary evidence. We have his papers, his lectures, the recollections of colleagues, but we don't have his interior life. We don't have his doubts, his hopes, his understanding of what he had found. And this matters because if we knew what Fleming thought, we would know something crucial about how scientific discovery works. We would know whether the gap between discovery and development is inevitable or preventable. We would know whether Fleming was a tragic figure who failed to realize his potential, or simply a normal scientist who made an important observation and did what he could with limited resources. We don't know. The evidence is ambiguous. The man is dead. The question remains open. Fleming's life after the Nobel Prize is less documented than his earlier years. He became a celebrity, yes. He traveled the world giving lectures. He received honors from dozens of countries. But what was his daily life like? What did he do with his sudden fame? He continued working at St. Mary's. He never fully retired. He studied antibiotic resistance. He investigated new antibacterial substances. He maintained his laboratory work, even as his public profile grew. His first wife, Sarah, died in 1949. They had been married for 34 years. Her death seems to have affected him deeply, though again, we have limited direct evidence. Fleming was not a man who discussed his emotions publicly. In 1953, at age 72, he married again. His second wife, Amalia Koutsuri-Vourikas, was a Greek bacteriologist who had worked at St. Mary's. She was decades younger than Fleming. They had a brief marriage, only 2 years before his death in 1955. These personal details give us glimpses of a man who, despite his fame, remained somewhat isolated. His social circle was largely limited to scientific colleagues. He was not a public intellectual in the broader sense. He was a bacteriologist who became famous, but remained, at his core, a bacteriologist. When he died in 1955, the world mourned, but the mourning was for the symbolic Fleming, the man who saved millions, not necessarily for the actual Fleming, the reserved Scottish scientist who had made an important observation and then watched others turn it into a revolution. The gap between the symbolic figure and the actual person is another kind of tragedy. Fleming became a myth in his own lifetime. The myth was necessary, perhaps. It inspired people, it gave them faith in science, it created a narrative of hope and progress. But myths flatten complexity. They erase doubt, uncertainty, failure. They turn messy human stories into clean parables. Fleming the myth is inspiring. Fleming the person is frustrating, contradictory, incomplete. Which Fleming should we remember? Both, probably. The myth because it represents something true about the power of observation and the importance of curiosity. The person because his limitations and failures are as instructive as his success. Let's pull back and look at the full arc one more time. Scottish farm boy, London clerk, medical student, army doctor, bacteriologist, discoverer, celebrity. This progression seems almost too perfect, too much like a designed narrative, but it happened. This was Fleming's actual life. What does it mean? What can we learn from a life that began in rural poverty and ended in global acclaim? What lessons does Fleming's story offer? One lesson is about preparation. Fleming was prepared to see what others missed because he had spent years thinking about antibacterial substances. Luck matters, but only when it meets preparation. Another lesson is about limits. Individual discovery is not enough. Development requires resources, institutions, coordination. Fleming could discover penicillin. He could not alone make it matter. A third lesson is about timing. The same discovery means different things at different moments. Penicillin in 1929 was ignored. Penicillin in 1941, during a desperate war, became an urgent priority. The substance didn't change, the context did. A fourth lesson is about consequences. Every solution creates new problems. Penicillin saved millions but created the conditions for antibiotic resistance. We are now dealing with those consequences. A fifth lesson is about narrative. The story we tell about Fleming shapes how we think about science, about discovery, about progress. If we tell it wrong, we misunderstand how these things actually work. These lessons are not simple. They don't reduce to inspirational quotes or easy takeaways. They're complex, contradictory, uncomfortable. Like Fleming himself, the standard story of penicillin is a feel-good story. Humble scientist makes lucky discovery. Discovery saves millions. Scientist receives well-deserved recognition. Science triumphs over disease. Progress marches on. But the real story is darker and more interesting. Scientist makes discovery. Discovery is ignored. Millions die unnecessarily. War creates desperation. Desperation drives development. Development creates new problems. Problems remain unsolved. Progress is temporary, incomplete, fragile. This version is less satisfying. It doesn't offer the comfort of clear resolution, but it's more honest, and honesty, especially about our medical past and present, is more valuable than comfort. Fleming's warning about antibiotic resistance in his Nobel speech was prescient. But prescience means nothing without response. We knew in 1945 that resistance would emerge. We knew what would happen. We watched it happen anyway. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Fleming's story. Knowledge is not enough. Understanding is not enough. Even perfect foresight is not enough. Action requires something more than knowledge. It requires will, resources, coordination, and the ability to prioritize long-term survival over short-term convenience. We failed then. We're failing now. And Fleming's story, for all its triumph, is ultimately a story about that failure. The post-antibiotic era is not a distant hypothetical. It's beginning now, Infections that were easily treatable a generation ago are becoming resistant. Procedures that were safe are becoming dangerous. We are sliding backward, and we know it, and we're not stopping it. Why? The reasons are complex: economic incentives, regulatory barriers, scientific challenges, political inertia, institutional failures. The same forces that prevented penicillin's development in the 1930s are preventing the development of new antibiotics now. Fleming's ghost should haunt us. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. Not because he did everything right, he didn't. But because his story shows us exactly how we fail. We discover things and don't develop them. We understand risks and don't prevent them. We see crises coming and don't respond until it's too late. The gap between knowing and doing is the space where people die. Fleming lived in that gap. We live in it now. And nothing has changed except the specific details of the crisis. There is no conclusion to this story because the story isn't over. Penicillin exists. Resistance exists. The tension between them continues. New antibiotics are being developed slowly, too slowly. Bacteria are evolving rapidly, too rapidly. The outcome is uncertain. Fleming discovered something that saved hundreds of millions of lives. That discovery is now losing its power. The miracle is ending. What comes next? We don't know. Maybe we'll develop new antibiotics in time. Maybe we'll find new approaches to fighting bacterial infection. Maybe we'll adapt to a world where infection is once again a major threat. Maybe we'll fail completely and watch modern medicine collapse back to its pre-penicillin state. Fleming can't answer these questions. He's been dead for 70 years. His warning was given. His discovery was made. His part in the story is complete. Our part is not. We are the ones living with the consequences. We are the ones facing the choice between responding to the crisis or watching it unfold. We are the ones who will determine whether Fleming's legacy is the permanent transformation of medicine or a temporary reprieve that we squandered. The story of Alexander Fleming is not just history. It's prophecy. It's showing us our future if we continue on our current path. It's showing us what happens when knowledge exists but action does not. It's showing us the cost of the gap between what we know and what we do. Fleming walked through mud that wasn't entirely mud. He saw soldiers die from infections that should have been treatable. That vision drove him to search for something better. He found it. The world almost lost it. We're losing it again now. This is the story, not a story of triumph, a story of warning, not a story about what we achieved, a story about what we're losing. Fleming saw the problem. He found an answer. The answer worked, then it stopped working. This cycle is not unique to penicillin. It's how we respond to every crisis. We solve it temporarily. We declare victory. We watch the solution decay. We fail to prepare for what comes next. The man who discovered penicillin spent his last decade warning about resistance. The warning was clear. The science was sound. The prediction was accurate. And we ignored it anyway because the crisis was theoretical and the benefit was immediate. Now the crisis is real. Now we're facing the consequences. Now Fleming's warning doesn't seem theoretical anymore, but it's too late for Fleming to help us. He did his part. He made his discovery. He issued his warning. What we do with that legacy is up to us. The contaminated petri dish in 1928 was not just a lucky accident. It was a moment when preparation met opportunity, when years of searching intersected with a precise alignment of conditions, when one man's trained eye saw what others would have discarded. That moment changed medicine. It saved countless lives. It created possibilities that hadn't existed before. But moments are not enough. Discoveries are not enough. Even revolutions are not permanent. Fleming's story is unfinished because we're still writing it. Every time a doctor prescribes an antibiotic, every time a patient takes one correctly or incorrectly, every time a pharmaceutical company decides whether to invest in antibiotic research, we're adding to Fleming's legacy. The question is what kind of legacy we're creating. one of sustained miracle or temporary reprieve, one of learning and adaptation or complacency and collapse. Fleming can't tell us which path we're on, only we can determine that. And the evidence so far is not encouraging. The man who saved millions warned us that the salvation was temporary. We thanked him and ignored the warning. Now we're learning what happens when warnings go unheeded, when knowledge exists without action, when we understand the problem but lack the will to solve it. This is Fleming's true legacy. Not the discovery, not the Nobel Prize, not the fame, but the warning, the prophecy, the ghost standing at the end of the antibiotic age, pointing backward at what we had and forward at what we're losing. We chose not to listen. We chose short-term benefit over long-term survival. We chose convenience over caution. We chose to believe that the miracle would last forever. It won't. It is not lasting. It is ending now in our time as we watch. Fleming saw it coming. He told us it was coming. We didn't believe him. Now we're learning that he was right. And by the time we fully understand that, it may be too late to matter. This is the story of Alexander Fleming. Not a hero's journey with a triumphant ending. A prophet's warning that went unheeded. A discovery that saved the world and a vision of that salvation's end. The story is unfinished because we haven't decided how it ends. We're still making that choice. Every day, every prescription, every decision about research and development and resource allocation. Fleming made his choice in 1928 when he looked at a contaminated dish and saw possibility instead of failure. He made his choice in 1945 when he stood in Stockholm and warned about resistance. He made his choices and lived with their consequences. Now we have to make ours and live with them and watch as the future he predicted becomes the present we inhabit. The mud in France is still there. The soldiers are gone, but the mud remains. The infections they died from are still there too, waiting, evolving, growing stronger as our weapons grow weaker. Fleming found a weapon that worked. We used it. Now it's failing, and the mud waits, patient and persistent, ready to reclaim the ground we thought we'd won forever. This is not a story about a lucky accident. It's a story about preparation, vision, institutional failure, human limitation, bacterial evolution, and the gap between discovery and development that costs millions of lives. It's a story about warning and prophecy and the human inability to act on future threats until they become present catastrophes. It's a story about Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin and warned about its end, who saved the world and told us the salvation wouldn't last, who was right about both. And it's a story about us, living in the gap between what he found and what he warned us was coming, still choosing what his legacy will ultimately mean.